There is there's a move in this country run by the fascists, by the Republicans, to put a stop to the First Amendment guarantee, the right to assemble peacefully, seeking redress of grievances from the government. In other words, demonstrations. Here's an example from North Dakota. About an hour after these police people cleared the last demonstrators against the Dakota Access Pipeline, the governor of North Dakota, Doug Burgum, signed into law 4 bills aimed at making it easier to control such protests. So, by signing his name, he placed the state of North Dakota in the front of an emerging backlash by conservative forces against political and social advocates who see demonstrations as free speech protected by the Constitution, no matter how unruly they get. Now, the demonstrations, sometimes under the same umbrella, but they're over immigration, the construction of these death pipelines, abortion, women's rights. Republicans, the legislators in at least 16 states, have filed bills intended to make protests either more orderly or to toughen penalties against the ones that aren't orderly. Now, what's orderly? The most orderly to the Republicans would be no demonstration at all. That's very orderly, right? We are supposed to sit back, not do anything, and let these fascist sons of bitches write us out of existence with their laws? Are you shitting me? But that's what they're trying to do. Republicans in 2 other states, North Carolina, expected, and Massachusetts? Massachusetts? 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm. Because, you know, his buddy was over in the North Church Tower. 1 if by land and 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be. Massachusetts! The Republicans there have said they are going to file bills to curtail and hopefully end protest. How's that go? I love that poem. It was the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is still alive who remembers that famous day and year. Blah, blah, blah. I love that poem. Now, the numbers that I just shared with you, 16 states and 2 more who are going to, North Carolina, Massachusetts, those numbers include only the states where bills whose sponsors have specifically linked them to protests and ending protests. And that's according to a guy who's a policy analyst who tracks the measures at the National Conference of State Legislatures. How many of these will be enacted is unclear. A few have already been pronounced DOA in committee. Now, one would think, wouldn't one, that such bullshit would be sliced and diced by the United States Supreme Court if these laws, and they're already enacted in certain states, well, North Dakota, and there are other states, if these bills become law, and if we are told, look, if you want to protest, no more than 200 people, and you will march single file on the right side of the road, and the volume of your chants cannot exceed yada, yada, yada. Or some variation of all that. Do you think the Supreme Court would say, yeah, that makes sense? Or do you think the Supreme Court would say, no, you can't do that because of the First Amendment guarantee of the right to peacefully assemble, the right of free association, the right of freedom of the press, all that stuff that the Republicans have made very clear they hate. On the other hand, with Justice Gorsuch on board and a couple of the liberals still on the court, I know Ruth Bader Ginsburg says she's there for the duration. I'm not sure what she means. I guess she means until she dies, bless her heart. But at some point in the next 4 years, unless Trump is removed from office, the Supreme Court is going to wind up heavily right-wing. So in this case, these cases of restricting the right of protests come to their attention or are presented in a court. Put on your thinking cap real quick and tell me how you think a neo-fascist court would rule. In my opinion, they would rule in favor of the ordinances because, we have to keep law and order, and Trump is the law and order president. And sometimes you have to restrict the rights of Americans. You remember Roosevelt and the Japanese internment. Sometimes you just have to do it, by golly. Some sociologists and legal experts say these bills are in line with the general trend toward tougher treatment of protesters, especially after those terrible, terrible people of Occupy Wall Street movement in Manhattan and the terrible, terrible, terrible reactions in Ferguson, Missouri. Black Lives Matter. We're going to get to a point we're not going to have any of that shit. Right? However, the piece here goes on to say that interviews and news reports suggest that some of the measures before these state legislatures are either backed by supporters of Trump or are responses to demonstrations against Trump and his policies. Well, there's a surprise, huh? An example, after a Nashville motorist struck safety workers who were escorting anti-Trump protesters at a crosswalk, a Tennessee state representative introduced legislation that would relieve motorists of any liability should they hit someone blocking a street. The Run 'em Down bill. An Iowa bill filed after about 100 anti-Trump protesters closed Interstate 80 near Iowa City. That bill would make blocking high-speed roads a felony, published by up to 5 years in prison and $7,500 in fines. Similar legislation in Mississippi would impose a fine of up to $10,000. In Washington State, this will never happen, a Republican senator who helped run Trump's campaign there filed legislation that would make it a felony to commit what he calls economic terrorism, defined as intentionally breaking the law to intimidate private citizens or to obstruct economic activity. Boy, that's real narrow, isn't it? What is economic? The World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle. Remember the battle in Seattle? That was economic activity, wasn't it? Do you understand what's going on here? Now, the language is in these bills, and let's drop any naivety that we might still be carrying around as unnecessary baggage. The specifics of the bill where they say, well, if you block a high-speed road, you're going to prison for 5 years. If you obstruct economic activity, you're going to prison. Now, how do you define that? I mean, let's say one person stands in the middle of I-80 with a sign that says, Trump's an asshole. Well, obviously, he's blocking a high-speed road, right? In other words, once these laws or these bills become laws and are on the books, they can be interpreted any goddamn way the arresting military wants to interpret them. And then, your ass gets tossed in jail. Maybe you can make bail, maybe you can't. And your case finally comes up before a judge, and you are found indictable, and it goes before a grand jury, and yada yada, and you wind up sitting in a jail for 6 months until your case comes up. What a convenient way to stop the anti-Trump protests in all its variable forms. This is happening. It's happening right now. Minnesota. A Minnesota bill responding to protests over the police murder last year of an African-American man in a suburb of St. Paul. This bill in Minnesota would allow cities to sue demonstrators who violate the law for the cost of policing their protests. Now that's novel, huh? We're going to sue you because you left your shitty anti-Trump signs in the middle of the road. And in North Carolina, a legislator there, these are all Republicans, promised to propose a measure making it illegal to, quote, threaten, intimidate, or retaliate against state officials after hecklers denounced former Governor Pat McCrory, who lost a re-election bid back in November. Illegal to threaten, intimidate, or retaliate. Now, what may intimidate you might make me laugh. But if you feel, and we all live in North Carolina, you feel intimidated, well, shit, you can have you could have the person doing it arrested. Making it illegal. I mean, in most states, it's already illegal to threaten somebody. Jesus. I mean, here in Georgia, I've said before, if you and I get into an argument on the street, and I say, you son of a bitch, if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to beat your ass. Woo-hoo. I can then be charged with, what's it called? Fighting words. Fighting word. We have a law in the books like that here in Georgia. If I say, I'm going to beat your ass, oh, fighting words. It's a misdemeanor, but I can go to jail for a year. Now, those two measures, the one in Minnesota and the one in North Carolina, according to a scholar of protest law at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University, he said, quote, there's a First Amendment right of access to sidewalks, public squares, and even public streets. And heckling, it's a well-protected First Amendment right. But the way some of these bills are being written, demonstrators who fail to inform authorities of their plans and where it's going to happen, and they have to secure a permit, the demonstrators are on very shaky legal grounds, because in those cases, actions like blocking a street would most likely be subject to prosecution. And in most of the cases, the sponsors of these bills, the Republicans, insist that they're only trying to improve public safety or keep order, make it safe for the protesters. They're not trying to squelch free speech. Oh, God forbid. What gave you that idea? A state senator in Florida, Republican, who proposed legislation that would levy pretty heavy fines for blocking traffic, and like the Tennessee measure, would indemnify drivers who ran over protesters. This guy said, quote, we support the First Amendment altogether and want people to get out and do what they want. but they shouldn't endanger themselves or others. It just keeps keeping on. Little by little, like a rat gnawing its way into a granary, just gnawing and gnawing until finally success. That's what's happening to civil liberties in this country.